Welcome to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where Peter Madison and David Sherrock discuss the complexities of adopting new ways of working at scale. Hello and welcome to another exciting episode. I'm here with Dave as always, and
I was going to say, maybe we need to be honest. We don't know if it will be an exciting episode until we get to the end of it, but
I'm sure we'll have a good conversation regardless.
We'll see where it goes. We'll see where it goes. And that was my part of, I think, what we wanted to talk about today is this concept of organizational honesty that we're seeing more and more, the difficulty of saying what needs to be said in different forms within an organization.
Yeah, which is an interesting concept. And you were mentioning just before when we started this off about it's not the accusation that everybody's lying. It's about whether there's the psychological safety for people to speak the truth, and how much is that occurring? Is the organization actually being transparent in how they're operating, or do things get swept under the carpet? Do we ignore them?
If we just use an example, if somebody comes to you and says, we have a delivery deadline, we're expecting to push a release out on the 31st of July. How are things progressing towards that deadline? That opens up a lot of different responses, which differ depending on how comfortable, what we know, first of all. Maybe we don't know what's going on. Yeah. Also, so there's a transparency and information piece. But there's also, we all know there are situations where we either stay quiet or we sort of mumble a response that says, yes, we're feeling that should happen.
Of course,
even maybe, even if we know there are things that need to be addressed that somehow we just don't feel it's the right forum, the right platform, the right people in the room, or just we don't feel comfortable bringing it up.
And especially say it's somebody more senior who's coming and saying, hey, so that here's this new exciting client that we've got to deal with, and we've got to have all of this ready by the end of September.
I always think of myself as an eternal optimist. So, of course, the natural response is, I think we can do that. But actually, there's a whole bunch of detail that we want to explore, right? We want to go down a little bit. So what is it that, Dave, why do you think we will be able to hit that deadline? And I think that's where things start becoming interesting.
Yeah, and then there's also what does hitting that deadline mean? So is because if we're not all agreed on that, then we're just going to be disappointed, because we can both say yes, of course we can, and then we get there and it's that's not what I wanted.
Yeah. Well, if I think of it if we just start articulating what that is, number one is we need information. Right?
Yes.
If I don't know what's going on, if I don't know what the teams are up to, where the packages of work are in terms of definition, in terms of have they been discussed with the team? Do we know where things are going? Do we know the capacity of the team? Do we know what the team's done in the past and what's coming up and things like this? There's information that needs to be at our fingertips to be able to answer that.
Yeah. And one of those pieces of information too is how different is this thing that we have to do now from all the things that we've done before? Yeah. Is this just a rinse and repeat where we know that it takes us this amount of time to stand up a new client? Or is this something that first time ever done it, no idea how long it's going to take?
Well, and we talk a lot about risk and managing risk, but there's a lot of that which is just the way I always think of it is sort of familiarity. So there's the data that we can rely on because the team has a historical, a record of delivering these things in a consistent manner. So there's confidence that we have around certain data points. There are other data points that we just don't really know or believe. So if maybe the team's coming together for the first time, or their technology is shifting, or there's some element of risk that we know is uncertain or complex or whatever might be in there. So there's numbers that we're not sure about. And I'd add as well the sense-making side of things. And we're right in the middle of football season, right? Well, World Cup, FIFA, and things like this. But if your team makes it to the next round and the next round, how does that impact your ability to deliver, for example? So there are the pure data side. It's the sort of sense making of, maybe vacations are coming up, or the team's had some change that we're not aware of, or we can only see from the outside. We can't see in the data.
Yeah, something that's coming out from outside. One of the most common, though, the one that we see a lot is that there's this loss in communication across
Yeah.
different parts of the organization, where different specialties or different areas have different expectations, and they communicate in a way that they think is clear and transparent and that everybody understands.
Yeah.
Um, but the message isn't carried through the organization. And that especially happens if they're operating largely independently of each other and uh, only coming together occasionally and not really thinking about the system more holistically.
And this is where now that organizational honesty piece comes in, because if I bring those disparate, those teams that don't necessarily work with one another on a frequent basis, how well can they communicate? Is there an environment where they can say what's really going on and not have that become a bone of contention, but is actually something that is just an observation of fact rather than an admission of guilt slash not having done something, or competence or planning ability, whatever it might.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's certain things that are, especially from a technology side, it becomes very difficult to articulate those, which is why you have people who are closer to the technology who understand it. But I mean, the same goes for other areas. They're closer to the problem set. They understand the complexities of that area. They understand what the requirements are, what the needs are. They understand that part of it. But it from outside looking in, it can see, well, that's all easy. I mean, that's
Yeah.
we,
Yeah.
there's nothing difficult over there. They can just get it done. So
Yeah. Well, and I think this becomes, what's the environment like? Can I come in and say, actually, we're not going to hit this deadline. This happened, this happened. There are these things going on. We've got new priorities. So the people, the effort that we were going to spend on doing the work you need is not going to happen. Now, if I come into into that conversation and I feel comfortable being transparent about what's really happening back at the ranch, if you like, back at where the team is working, and there's a constructive conversation. Is that the right decision for the organization? Do we need to escalate this and get some reprioritization? Can we just go and reset expectations with our stakeholders? What are the consequences of that information coming to the table? And I think that's where we really start hitting real problems, because there are scenarios where I can't afford to do that.
mm-hmm.
That is a career limiting, or it's going to generate more work just to validate the information that we're trying to bring to the table. And in those situations, we're going to change what we say, probably going to change what we say.
Yeah, we're going to protect ourselves very often is the approach. It's a common situation, and now why don't we switch gears a little, because we've talked a lot about, oh my God, the world is terrible and nobody communicates well, and but I mean, there's lots of areas that we could explore from here. But let's switch gear into thinking about what are some of the things that we know work to help resolve some of these things.
So let me go back to one of the first things, which is that information, and having information to be able to have a conversation around. And so that is visible progress of some sort. So there are lots of different ways of doing that, but we certainly need to share and have on all sides of the conversation this sort of visual on, and we talk about output and outcomes. So we need to know a little about activity, but actually we don't, that's not the information that's useful. The information is the outcomes, the things that we're actually delivering. So am I able to hand over a complete piece of work to your team to do what they need to do with it? Not how busy has that team been. So the first thing I think is just around visual management and sharing of the right pieces of information.
I think along with that is the right forums to look at that information and compare it and make decisions from that information. And that's often where that trust comes in. Within that scenario, is everybody comfortable with saying that here's what's really happening here?
Yeah. Yeah.
Here's what we need to do now.
It's really interesting. Like there's a big difference between let me prepare a report as to what's been going on versus let's look at systems. Nowadays, there are work management systems. You can see real time what's happening. So there's an organization where we're trusted to be able to bring up those real work management systems and be accountable for what we see when we look into what the teams are actually doing is a really good sign. So So whenever I look at those visual management systems, my goal is that they are cheap to produce. And by that, I mean that we're not manually manipulating and adding context and things like this, but we're just drawing out that information, hopefully from some sort of relevant near real-time work management systems, for example. And then secondly, that we're comfortable sharing things without having to layer in explanation or managing what's being shared so that we can actually see what's going on
Yeah.
rather than interpretations of what's going on.
Having good structures to enable that communication to is kind of key there too. It's the ways in which this is how we communicate. This is how we present information. This is how this conversation is structured. Will help a lot with making sure that happens the way that it should.
And this is one of those things where typically I look at burn down charts, we look at burn up charts, we look at like real time, release boards and things like this, because we want to see these packages of work moving around and the dependencies and what's being worked on and what's not yet being worked and so on, rather than a spreadsheet with a bunch of data and numbers that is just sort of distant from what we're actually trying to see.
So I think one of the other key parts is having an understanding of what the end-to-end system is. Like, what are all the things that are involved in this? How long does it typically take to get through some of these pieces? Because then you can start to see where are the bottlenecks, where do I have constraints, where do I have areas where I need to focus to help this go better. And that's, I mean, a very critical part of understanding that part of it. We could go on. There's lots of There's lots of pieces. I think one key part is as well is it's the incremental aspect of this. It's I'm going to build everything and it's going to spend a year building it, then I'm going to put it in front of a customer for the first time. Yeah, your mileage may vary. You might get it right, but
well, I think that whole feedback loop piece of some sort of integrated whole that we're looking at. I also wanted to make sure we spend a little bit of time talking about safety and being able to come to a meeting and be transparent about what's really going on, because I think this is the bit which really is the hardest for us to get moving. Because if I come in from a different organization, or I've had experience of working in multiple organizations, the likelihood is I know when I turn up to these sort of status conversations or progress conversations or whatever it is, I'm going to be cautious. I'm going to observe and find out if somebody brings bad news to the table, what happened? Is it accepted? Is it treated with supportive conversations, or is it treated as a failure mode that now, the classic one is if you bring a problem to the table, you have to bring two solutions or bring a solution to the table. That one immediately means if I have a problem that I cannot solve, I'm not going to bring it. But equally, if I bring a problem to the table and I immediately have to go back and re-estimate everything and revisit and come back and somehow just provide more and more data to show why it's a problem, instead of us beginning to understand and where to work, why would I bring work to the table, a problem that generates more work for my team or myself to do? I'm probably not going to do that. So the first thing that happens in those forums is we're going to observe what happens when bad news is brought to the table.
Yeah, and this is just human behavior, and it's interesting how everybody in those meetings tends to be coming with their own view, their own agenda, their own set of problems, their own backlog of work that needs to be done. Having a set of structures within that status meeting to be able to have those conversations becomes critical, because otherwise you just end up as all of the things you just described. It's usually one of those that occurs. You turn up and it's the don't shoot the messenger, but the messenger is invariably shot. So.
Yes. Well, and it's a natural, like if I hear bad news, if your team comes in and says, I can't give you what you need, I'm immediately pushed into a defensive space. So I really like what you said about the structures. That's why there is structure in these conversations, is so that we can follow the structure and it allows us to kind of mentally realign and go, okay, great, I need to change what I was thinking would happen, and we can make those adjustments. So the structure becomes really, really important because it allows information to come to the table and not be reacted to, but to be absorbed and understood and then responded.
Yeah, indeed. So I think we're about at the point in the conversation we should start to wrap this up. So if we want our listeners to go away with 3 points today about honest organizations, what 3 points would you suggest we start with, Dave?
The first point would be information, making sure we've got transparency into the information that we would be using in that conversation.
Yeah, and that information being radiated and transparent, easy to understand in the right ways that people can draw upon it. It's possible to create a lot of information, but it's the information that's actually relevant and the ability to understand it and know what this means that becomes critical.
I think a second thing just to add in is that safety. And I liked what you mentioned about structure. We didn't talk too much about the structure, but having a forum where we can share bad news and we know that will be treated in a constructive way. So there's a whole bunch of things to go into about how to create that environment where there's some safety for a constructive conversation. But we have to recognize that people will observe behaviors. And as soon as we see any behaviors that make it painful or costly to raise difficult conversations, difficult topics, like things aren't working the way they need to, immediately it puts a barrier to bringing those topics to the table. So how do we make it easy to bring these topics to the table?
I think as a third point to wrap us up here, I think remembering to look at the entire system and the interdependencies. You talked about this too. Like, where are the dependencies in the system? Where are the constraints? Where is work piling up? You'll start to see or understand some of that from the data, but that's only valuable if you understand how the data relates to what the system is. So understanding how work flows is absolutely critical. And if it's basically ad hoc, it's everything's an email and whoever yells the loudest gets the work done, well, yes, then maybe thinking about how can we maybe do this better, and how can we put practices into place to help that work flow would be a good thing. So with that, I'd like to thank you, Dave, and we'll wrap up there for today. And don't forget to hit subscribe, and we always like new listeners. And with that, you can send any feedback to feedback@definitelymaybeagile.com. Thank you.
Thanks again. Until next time.
You've been listening to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where your hosts, Peter Madison and David Sharrock, focus on the art and science of digital, agile, and DevOps at scale.